At 68 years old, the only thing Ruth Avery inherited from her late husband was a stretch of barren land on the edge of Colton and a dry, forgotten well that no one had touched in decades. No money, no life insurance, no answers. Just 40 acres of red dirt the whole county had written off as worthless, and a hole in the ground Harold had made her promise, with the last serious look he ever gave her, that she would never, ever fill in. For 3 weeks after the funeral, Ruth tried to forget about that well. She cleaned the house. She answered the sympathy cards. She folded Harold's shirts into a donation bin and kept his brown corduroy jacket because it still smelled like him. But every morning, when she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee, her eyes drifted east past the fence line toward the place where that well sat hidden in the dead grass. And every morning, the same questions clawed a little deeper. What had Harold been doing out there every Saturday for 43 years? Why had he begged her to leave that well alone? And what was waiting at the bottom? Before I tell you what she found down there and why it changed everything, tell me, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? I always wonder how far stories like this really travel. The funeral was on a Tuesday in early March, cold enough that the ground was still hard under their boots. 23 people showed up. Ruth counted them. She stood at the front and listened to Pastor Davy say kind things about a man who would have hated every minute of his own funeral, because that was Harold Avery. He didn't like attention. He liked quiet mornings and black coffee in the same chipped mug he'd been using since the 70s. He liked driving out to that piece of land every Saturday and doing whatever he did out there work that left red dirt on his boots and a strange kind of peace on his face. "What do you do out there all day?" she had asked him once, maybe 15 years back. "Checking on things," he said. "Checking on what? There's nothing out there." He had smiled at her, then that half-smile of his, the one that said, "I know something you don't, and I can't explain it yet. There will be." That was Harold. Never enough words, always enough certainty. On the 4th day after the funeral, the phone rang. Claire, her daughter, 2 hours south in the city. The kind of woman who handled grief the way she handled hospital budgets, with a spreadsheet and a plan. "Mom, I've been thinking about Dad's land. There's a developer offering $42,000. That's real money. That could go toward a nice place near me." 2 days later, Ruth found the brochure tucked between the sympathy cards. Sunrise Gardens, Assisted Living. A white-haired woman smiling on a patio with a potted plant. Ruth looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked to the kitchen and dropped it into the recycling bin. She was not selling Harold's land, because Harold had asked her for one thing in the last October of his life. One thing. He had been sitting in his chair by the window, already thinner than he should have been, his hands looking too big for his wrists. "Don't ever fill it in, Ruth." "Harold, it's a hole in the ground. Promise me." She had promised. She didn't ask why. That was the thing about being married to Harold Avery for 43 years. You learned which questions he would answer, and which ones he would carry to his grave. The well, apparently, was both. On a Monday morning in late March, Ruth woke at 5 and could not go back to sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about Harold's face the night he asked her to promise. He had never looked at her that way about anything else, not their savings, not the children, not his diagnosis. Just the well. She got up. She made coffee. She walked to the garage. Harold's workbench was the way he had always kept it neat, ordered every tool on its pegboard hook. In the corner, a coil of heavy rope. Next to it, his big flashlight. She tested it against the wall. The beam came on strong the way Harold always kept his batteries fresh. Ruth put on her boots. She pulled on her heavy work jacket. She slid her hands into Harold's old work gloves, and her fingers swam inside the leather, where his had worn the shape of him into the seams. She drove the truck out to the land. The well sat 50 yards past the old fence, surrounded by dead grass and flat red earth. Stone-lined, about 4 feet across, with a heavy wooden cover, weathered gray. She lifted it. The smell came up first. Cold earth. Damp stone. Something ancient. She knelt at the edge and shined the flashlight down. The beam reached maybe 30 feet before the darkness swallowed it. 68 years old, widowed 3 weeks. About to climb down into a hole her husband had been digging in secret since before their daughter was born. She tied the rope around her waist, looped it twice around the iron post Harold had sunk next to the well, a post she had passed 100 times and never once asked about. She swung her legs over the edge and started climbing down. The footholds were there. Crude steps carved into the rock every 18 inches, all the way down. Harold had cut every single one. She could see the wear of the stone where his boots had landed. He had made this descent hundreds of times. Maybe thousands. 20 feet down she paused and shined the flashlight at the wall. Notches. Small, careful cuts grouped in sets of 5. She counted them. 30 groups. 30 years of Saturdays carved into stone. Her hands were shaking inside Harold's gloves, and it was not from the cold. She kept going. 30 feet. 40. At 45 feet, the flashlight slipped. It happened fast. Her glove was too big. Her grip was wrong. The flashlight turned once in the air, the beam spinning wild circles against the stone walls, and then it hit the bottom somewhere far below with a sharp crack and went dark. Total darkness. Not dim, not shadowed. Total. The kind of darkness that has weight that presses against your open eyes and makes you wonder if they are still working. Ruth gripped the stone wall with both hands. Her breath came in short, sharp pulls. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. 45 feet underground. Alone. No one in the world knew she was here. If she fell, if the rope gave way, they would find her body at the bottom of a well that nobody knew existed, beside a camp stool that smelled like her dead husband. For 30 seconds, she considered climbing back up, calling Claire, accepting the brochure, living out her remaining years in a clean, quiet room with a potted plant on the patio and the safe, small life of a woman who had decided that the darkness was not worth entering. Then the wind moved across the mouth of the well, far above her, and it made a sound like a long, slow breath. And in the dark, she heard Harold's voice. Not a ghost, not a whisper, just a memory rising from the same place in her chest where she had kept him for 43 years. There will be. She lowered her right foot, found the next step. 18 inches below, the last exactly where Harold had carved it. She lowered her left foot, found the next. She climbed the rest of the way down in total darkness, trusting nothing but the footholds her husband had cut into stone, each one placed with the same patient, steady certainty that had defined every single thing he had ever done. When her boots hit flat ground, she knelt and felt the floor until her fingers found the flashlight. She shook it once. The beam came back on strong and steady, the way Harold always kept his batteries fresh. She exhaled. "All right, Harold," she said to the empty well. Her voice was shaking. "I'm here." The space was wider than the shaft, maybe 6 feet across, carved into a rough circle. Against one wall leaned a pickaxe, worn smooth as river stone. Next to it, a folding camp stool, the canvas faded almost to white. And on a shelf cut into the rock, sealed with silver duct tape, sat a green metal ammunition box. Ruth stared at that box for a long time. She lifted it off the shelf, sat down on the camp stool, his stool the canvas shaped to his body, peeled away the tape strip by strip. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a leather-bound journal. Beneath it, 4 sealed envelopes, labeled in Harold's block handwriting with single numbers 10, 20, 30, 40. A folded survey map, and a brass compass tarnished green with age. She picked up the brass compass last. It was heavier than it looked, tarnished green, with decades of handling. She turned it over. On the back, scratched into the metal with the tip of something sharp, a nail maybe, or a pocket knife, were 2 letters. R.A., her initials, carved by his hand. Harold had carried her down here with him every Saturday for 30 years. She just hadn't known it. She opened the journal to the first page and read the first line. The sound that came out of her echoed off the stone walls 62 feet below a piece of land the whole county had written off as worthless. Ruth, if you're reading this, it means I didn't finish in time, but you will. She read it 3 times, tracing the grooves his pen had pressed into the paper. I know what you're thinking, he had written. You're thinking, what has this old fool been doing out here all this time? And you're sitting on my camp stool at the bottom of a well, which means you're already braver than you give yourself credit for. The journal began with a date, June 14th, 1978. Harold had been 23, working for the county water department. They had sent him to survey this 40-acre parcel land nobody wanted. I found something, he wrote. 3 test bores all showing the same thing. Below the limestone shelf at 50 feet, the limestone thins out. And below that, clay the kind you only find sitting on top of a pressurized aquifer. I ran the numbers 4 times, Ruth. There's water down there, a lot of it. Probably been there for 10,000 years. Nobody at the county office cared. The land stayed classified as barren. A year later, it went up for sale, $4,200 for 40 acres. Harold withdrew the money from their savings before Ruth got home from her teaching job. She remembered that night. Harold told her over dinner. She set down her fork. You spent $4,000 on what? Land. We were saving that for Claire's college fund. I know. But Ruth, this land is not what people think it is. They had fought about it for a year. The cold, quiet kind of fight, without shouting, but without warmth either. She never asked again. He never volunteered. Ruth opened the first envelope, the one marked 10. Dear Ruth, we've been married 10 years today. You're in the kitchen right now making that lemon cake, the one you say doesn't come out right, but always does. I'm sitting in my chair pretending to read the paper. I've been digging for 10 years. I'm at 22 feet. I found the first limestone layer right where my survey said it would be. I know you think I wasted our money, but I'm building something, Ruth. For you. For after. I just can't explain it yet. She opened the envelope marked 20. 20 years. I'm at 38 feet. Hit a seam of white limestone last spring that nearly broke my back. But below it, the rock is softer, wet in places. I can smell the water some mornings. I know that sounds crazy, but when you've been digging toward something this long, you start to feel it before you see it. She opened the envelope marked 30. 30 years. My knees are giving out. I'm at 58 feet. The clay changed color last year, red with gray veins. That's exactly what my survey predicted just above the aquifer cap. I am close, Ruth. I can hear it sometimes when I press my ear to the wall. A hum. Water moving through rock sounds like nothing else in the world. I started bringing a camp stool so I can rest between swings. I'm going to finish this. But if I don't, everything you need is in this box. She looked at the camp stool she was sitting on, put her hand on the worn canvas, and felt the shape of him still pressed into it. She looked at the fourth envelope, the one marked 40. Their 40th anniversary would have been in November. Harold died in February, 9 months before they reached it. She set it back in the box. Not yet. She picked up the survey map instead. Harold had drawn it by hand. A cross-section of the land layer by layer, with a wide blue band at the bottom labeled aquifer, pressurized, estimated depth 80 feet. A vertical line ran from the surface down. The well. At regular intervals he had written depths: 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 62. The last number had a date beside it, September 12th, 2025, 5 months before he died. Below 62, the line continued in dashes, 18 more feet, ending at the blue band. And next to the dashes, in careful block letters, Harold had written one word: Ruth. He hadn't run out of time. He had left the last 18 feet for her. The next morning, Ruth drove into town and bought supplies. 100 feet of new rope, a pulley system, steel buckets, a new pickaxe, work gloves in her size. She was pulling out of the hardware store when she saw Jesse, a young man 22 or 23, sunburned across the nose, mowing the empty lot next to the gas station with an old push mower. He lived in the single-wide trailer bordering Harold's land. Harold had lent him tools more than once, and the tools always came back cleaned and oiled. Ruth pulled over. "Jesse, I need help with something on Harold's land. Physical work. Might take a while." His eyes drifted to the rope and pickaxe in the truck bed. "What kind of work?" "Digging." "I pay $15 an hour. Cash." He nodded once. "I'll be there." That evening, Claire called again. The developer raised his offer, $55,000. "Tell him no." "Mom, please. You're 68 years old, digging a hole in the ground." "I'm finishing what your father started." Claire said the thing she had been holding back for weeks. Dad chased every project he ever started. The shed, the engine, the cabin at the lake. It always came to nothing. And I am watching you do this in his name, and it is going to break you. Ruth let the silence stretch. Then she said, "This is different, Claire." "How?" "Because he didn't not finish it. He ran out of time. Those are two different things." The following afternoon, a black pickup truck pulled up along the fence line. A man in a pressed shirt and clean boots stepped out and walked toward Ruth with the polite, patient stride of a person who had bought 100 pieces of land from 100 widows. "Mrs. Avery, I don't mean to intrude. My name is Dale Gentry. I've been speaking with your daughter about the property." Ruth set down her water bottle. "I know who you are." He leaned against his truck and looked out at the red dirt. "Ma'am, I've had 3 surveyors look at this parcel over the years. Dry soil. No water table worth mentioning. $55,000 is a generous offer for 40 acres of nothing. And I should be honest with you, if you don't take it by end of month, I'll be buying the parcel east of here instead. After that, there won't be another offer." Ruth looked at him. She thought about Harold at 23, standing on this same ground with a survey report nobody else believed. "My husband spent 30 years disagreeing with your surveyors," she said. "I think I'll give him a little more time to be right." Gentry smiled the thin, careful smile of a man who recognized stubbornness but did not respect it. He tipped his hat and drove away. Ruth watched his truck disappear down the road. Then she looked at the well. 30 days. Harold, she thought. We have 30 days. Jesse arrived at 6:45 the next morning. Ruth handed him coffee. They stood at the well looking at the supplies. "How deep are we going?" he asked. 62 feet down already. We need 18 more. He was quiet, working that number through his head. Who dug 62 feet? My husband. Over 30 years. Over 30th. Jesse looked at her, the way a person looks when they are recalibrating what they thought they knew about somebody. He did not ask why. He just said, "Show me." The plan was simple. Jesse went down with the pickaxe. He loosened rock and filled the bucket. Ruth hauled it up with the pulley. They worked in that rhythm until the day ran out. The first time metal struck stone, the sound came up the shaft, the steady rhythmic ring Harold had made 1,000 times. The land had been quiet for 3 weeks since they buried him. Now, the sound was back. Ruth closed her eyes and listened. Then she tightened her grip on the rope. For the first time since her husband died, she felt something she had been afraid she would never feel again. Purpose. By the end of the first week, they had gone 3 feet deeper. Every morning, before Jesse went down, Ruth read him the relevant entry from Harold's journal, the depth, the color of the rock, what Harold predicted they would find next. Jesse listened the way she used to wish her third-graders would listen, with his whole body still. Margaret from down the road showed up on the 8th day carrying a covered casserole dish. Ruth told her everything, the journal, the aquifer, the 18 feet. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Ruth finished, Margaret set the dish on the tailgate. "That's a chicken casserole. I'll bring another one Friday." That was Margaret. She did not offer her opinion on whether Harold had been a visionary or a fool. She brought food, and she came back. Every day after that. She set up a camp chair 10 feet from the well, brought paperback novels and iced tea, and sat there reading while Ruth hauled buckets. She made Ruth feel less alone without ever making her feel watched. On the 12th day, a section of the well wall gave way. It happened without warning. One moment, Jesse was swinging the pickaxe in steady rhythm. The next, a slab of stone the size of a dinner table broke free from the wall and crashed down past his shoulder, missing his head by inches. The sound it made when it hit the floor shook the ground under Ruth's boots at the surface. "Jesse!" Ruth screamed into the shaft. Silence. 3 seconds of it, the longest 3 seconds of Ruth's life. Then his voice tight and careful. "I'm okay. I'm coming up." He climbed out slowly. His face was gray. His hands were shaking. He sat down on the tailgate of his truck and did not speak for a long time. He looked at the well, the way a man looks at a door he is not sure he wants to walk through again. That evening, Ruth called Margaret. "He's not coming back," Ruth said. "You don't know that." I saw his face. He looked the way Harold looked when the doctor told him it was stage 4. Margaret was quiet. Then she said, "That boy has been showing up at your land every morning for 2 weeks. He hasn't had anyone to show up for in a long time. Give him until tomorrow." The next morning, Ruth stood at the well alone with 2 cups of coffee. 7 o'clock. 7:15. The dirt road stayed empty. She looked at the second cup in her hand. Jesse's cup, and she thought about Harold's cup sitting on the shelf at home, and she wondered how many cups of coffee a person could pour for people who were never coming back. At 7:22, Jesse's truck turned onto the dirt road. He parked. He stepped out. He took the coffee without a word, drank half of it standing there, and then climbed down into the well. Ruth never asked him about the 22 minutes. Some questions answer themselves just by ending. On the 20th day, Jesse's voice echoed up the shaft with an urgency Ruth had not heard before. "Ruth, get down here. Something's happening." She went down fast. Jesse was pointing at the wall. A thin line of moisture was seeping through the clay, tracing a dark path down the stone. Water. Actual water. Ruth's breath caught. She reached out and touched it. Wet. Cold. Real. "Harold!" she whispered. They watched it for 10 minutes. The line grew slightly. Ruth could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment 30 years of Saturdays had been building toward. Then the line stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The moisture on the wall dried at the edges. Within 20 minutes, the seep had shrunk to a damp spot no bigger than Ruth's palm. Within an hour, even that was gone. Jesse climbed out slowly. He did not look at her. "Might have been a pocket," he said. "Trapped water in the limestone. Happens sometimes." Ruth said nothing. Jesse wiped his face with his forearm. "Ruth, what if he was wrong?" The question hung between them like something with weight. Ruth looked east toward the flat red earth. The same earth Harold had driven to every Saturday for 30 years. The same earth that had just given them a promise and taken it back. "Then he was wrong," she said quietly. "And I will have spent a month at the bottom of a hole learning what my husband believed in. That's not nothing, Jesse." That night, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with Harold's journal and the developer's business card side by side. She stared at both of them for a very long time. She picked up the journal, opened it to the year 30 entry, read the line again. "I'm going to finish this, but if I don't, everything you need is in this box." She closed the journal. She picked up the business card. She held it over the trash can. Her hand did not move for almost a minute. Then she let go. The card fluttered down into the dark. The next morning she went back to the well. On the 22nd day, Jesse called up from the bottom. "Ruth, come look at this." She climbed down. Jesse was pointing his headlamp at the wall. The clay was deep iron red, with veins of gray running through it in branching patterns like a river system frozen into stone. This was different from the false seep 2 days before. This was not moisture. This was color, structure. The earth itself had changed. Ruth pulled Harold's journal from her jacket and read aloud. "When you hit red clay with gray veins, you're close. That's the cap layer. The aquifer is directly below." She reached out and pressed her palm against the red clay. Cold. Wet. Not surface moisture this time. Deep structural dampness pressing up through the clay from something massive underneath. She could feel it pushing against her glove, the way you feel heat pushing through a closed oven door. She kept her hand there for a long time. 68 years old, standing at the bottom of a well, her husband spent a lifetime digging her palm against the cold, wet proof that he had been right about everything. "Jesse, we're close. For real this time." He didn't answer. He just picked up the pickaxe. On the 26th day, at 78 feet, it happened. Jesse was working alone at the bottom. Ruth was hauling the third bucket of the morning. The steady ring of metal on rock had been the soundtrack of every morning for almost a month. Then, in a single swing, the sound stopped. Not a clang, not a thud, just a muffled give, as if the pickaxe had gone into the wall and not come back out. Silence. Ruth held the rope very still and listened. Then Jesse's voice came up the shaft. Quiet. Almost reverent. "Ruth, come down here." She went down faster than she ever had before. Jesse was holding the pickaxe loose at his side, the blade still buried in the wall. He had not pulled it out. A thin line of water, clear bright, no thicker than a pencil, was running from where the pickaxe had punctured the clay. It traced down the wall in a steady stream, hit the floor, and pooled around his boot. Ruth stared at it. Her body went rigid. She had seen water come through this wall before. 2 days ago, it had stopped. 2 days ago, it had been a lie. She watched the thin line for 10 seconds. 20, 30. It did not slow. It did not shrink. If anything, it grew slightly wider, the stream finding its path with the quiet confidence of a thing that has been waiting behind a door for 10,000 years. This was not a pocket. This was not trapped moisture in limestone. This was the aquifer. Ruth reached out and took the handle. Harold's pickaxe, worn smooth by 30 years. She pulled it free. The wall gave. Water came through. Not a flood. A steady, confident flow. The stream split into 3. They traced paths down the wall and joined the small pool at the bottom, and the pool began to widen. Ruth watched it cover the toes of her boots. It rose around the place where Harold's camp stool had sat, around the patch of floor where his boots had rested for 30 years, around the smooth dent where his pickaxe had landed again and again, all those Saturday mornings. "Mrs. Ruth," Jessie whispered, "we got water." They climbed out together. Jessie went first, then Ruth behind him. When they stood on the surface again, soaked to the knees, blinking in the April sunlight, Jessie looked down into the well for a long time. Then he said something Ruth did not expect. "My dad left too," he said quietly. "But he didn't leave anything behind. Not a letter, not a plan, not even a reason." He looked at her. "Harold left you a reason." Ruth held his gaze. She understood then that Jessie had not been digging for $15 an hour. He had been digging for something he had never been given proof that a man could leave behind something worth finding. Ruth sat down on the foothold her husband had carved with his own hands. She put her face in Harold's work gloves, and for the first time since the funeral with witnesses without shame, she cried. She cried for the boy he had been in 1978 with his survey map and his terrible certainty. She cried for the young man lowering himself into a hole no one believed in. She cried for the man with the bad knees and the camp stool, saying, "I am close, Ruth." She cried for the false water 2 days ago that had almost made her give up. She cried for 43 years of Saturdays. Jessie did not move. He had the good sense to understand that some things are not yours to comfort. Some things are simply yours to witness. When she was finished, she wiped her face with Harold's glove. She bent down and cupped a handful of water into her palm. Cold. Painfully cold, the cold of something that has lived in the dark of the earth for longer than human beings have known how to write. It tasted of stone and iron, and something old and clean, and entirely Harold's. She drank it. "You were right," she said to the wall. "You old, stubborn, patient man. You were right about every single thing." The water rose for 2 weeks, exactly as Harold's notes predicted. By the end, it held at 30 feet from the surface, steady, with the calm certainty of a thing that had arrived where it was meant to be. Ruth installed a hand pump at the wellhead. The first time water came out of the spout, clear, cold, sparkling in the April sunlight, she filled a mason jar and set it on the kitchen table next to Harold's journal. Dale Gentry came back 3 days after the pump went in. Word travels fast in Colton. This time he did not lean against his truck. He walked all the way to the well and stood there looking at the water coming out of the spout with the expression of a man watching his own certainty dissolve. "I'll offer 200,000, he said. "Cash, this week." Ruth worked the pump handle once. Water came out clear and cold into the mason jar she was holding. She took a long, slow drink. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Mr. Gentry," she said, "my husband spent 30 years digging this well. You spent 30 seconds deciding it was worthless. I think I'll trust the man who did the digging." He left and did not come back. That evening, she sat down to read the journal more carefully. The later entries, the ones from the last 2 years of Harold's life, when his handwriting had begun to loosen, and his observations had grown shorter. She turned a page and stopped. An entry from October 2024, 4 months before he died. There's a young man living in the trailer next to the south fence. I lent him my chainsaw last week. He brought it back the next day, cleaned and sharpened. That tells me everything I need to know about him. If you need help with the last part, Ruth, look south. Ruth read it twice. Then she set the journal down and stared at the kitchen wall for a very long time. Harold had known about Jesse, not his name, not his story, but he had seen the one thing that mattered, a young man who returned a borrowed tool the next day, cleaned and sharpened. That was Harold's entire philosophy in one observation. You could tell everything you needed to know about a person by what they did with something that wasn't theirs. "You planned this too, didn't you?" she said to the empty kitchen. "You old fox. You planned everything." She opened the section in the back of the journal. Pages about what would grow once the water came. Tomatoes, brandywine, and Cherokee purple. Pole beans along the east fence. Squash along the south border. And pecan trees along the south fence line, 12 of them 20 feet apart. They'll take 7 years to bear, but once they do, they'll bear for 100. They'll outlive both of us. He had planned what this dead land would become, and he had written it all down for her. Ruth and Jesse planted the first row of tomatoes in late April. Within 2 weeks, green shoots pushed up from the earth. Ruth stood at the edge of the planted row with her coffee, looking at them, small, fragile, defiantly alive against the red dirt of land the whole county had declared dead, and she felt something she had been afraid to feel for 2 months. Hope. Then on a Thursday afternoon, her boot caught on a root. She went down hard. Her hip came down on a stone and the breath went out of her completely. The doctor said dehydration and exhaustion. A full week off her feet. The hardest part was sitting on the porch watching other people work her land. Jesse came every morning. Margaret organized help. Frank from the feed store checked the pump on weekends. And on the third afternoon of forced rest, Ruth felt something she had not expected. She felt angry. At Harold. She said it out loud to his empty chair. "You stubborn old man. You could have told me. Any one of those Saturdays. You could have let me help. You could have let me dig with you. I could have carried a bucket. We could have done this together all those years. And you let me sit in that kitchen alone every Saturday morning, thinking you were avoiding me." The empty chair did not answer. After a few minutes, the anger started to settle, not because it had gone away, but because she had let it through. The way the aquifer had let through its water once the clay finally gave. And underneath the anger, Ruth understood something. Harold's love had always come in actions, not words. He didn't know how to say it. In 43 years, he had said, "I love you," perhaps a dozen times, but he had built her a chicken coop the spring after Claire was born. He had sat up with her every night for 2 weeks when her mother died, saying almost nothing, holding her hand. Harold loved the way some men love, with work, with time, with patience. And in the last 3 decades of his life, he had loved her with a 60-foot hole in the ground and a journal he could not bring himself to read aloud. Claire came on a Saturday in early May. She stood in the driveway and looked at the land. The last time she had been here was the funeral. Now, where there had been nothing, there were rows. Tomatoes, almost a foot tall. Bean vines climbing their stakes. 12 thin pecan saplings along the south fence. She walked the property without speaking. She touched the leaves of a tomato plant. She stood beside the well and looked down at the dark water, still and patient and real. She came up to the porch. Her eyes were already wet. Ruth handed her the year 30 letter. Claire sat down on the top step and read it. When she got to the part about Harold's knees giving out about the camp stool, about the 20 feet he still had left, she put one hand over her mouth and read the rest through her fingers. "I didn't know," she said. "All those Saturdays. I thought he was avoiding us." "He wasn't avoiding you. He was building something he couldn't explain." Why didn't he tell us? Ruth thought about it. Because he wasn't finished. And your father never talked about things he hadn't finished. He was afraid he was wrong. He was afraid that if he told us and the water never came, we would have spent the rest of our lives looking at him like he had wasted his adulthood on a hole in the ground. Claire slept in her old room that night. In the morning, Ruth found her sitting in Harold's chair on the porch, watching the sun come up over her father's garden. Ruth sat down beside her. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. That evening, after Claire drove home, Ruth sat alone on the porch with a cup of tea. She reached into the ammunition box and pulled out the last envelope. The one marked 40. She had carried it up from the well 2 months ago and had not been able to open it. Their 40th anniversary would have been in November. Harold died in February. He had written this knowing he might not be there. The envelope was thinner than the others. She opened it. His handwriting was different. The careful block letters had loosened. The lines slanted downward the way his handwriting had begun to slant in the last year when the cancer was working on his hands, the way the years had worked on his knees. Dear Ruth, 40 years. I started this letter 3 times and threw the others away because I couldn't get it right. The other letters were easy because they were about the well. This one is harder because it's about you. I know you think I bought that land because I was stubborn, and you are right. But that wasn't the whole reason. I bought it because I needed something to build for you that was bigger than me, something that would still be here after I wasn't. The well was never just about water, Ruth. It was about making sure you had a reason to get up in the morning when I wasn't going to be the one to give you coffee anymore. Ruth set the letter down on her knee. She looked at the 2 coffee cups on the railing. One full, one empty. She had been pouring 2 cups for 43 years. She had not understood until this moment that Harold had been planning for that too. She picked the letter up again. I am leaving you the hard part on purpose. I know that isn't fair. A kinder man would have finished the well himself and left you the water and let you sit in the garden and miss me quietly. But I know you, Ruth, better than you know yourself, which I realize is a dangerous thing to write to a woman who once threw a boot at me for saying her meatloaf was dry. I know that if I left you the water, you would have sat in that house for a year and grieved me into the ground. I know that if I left you a finished project, you would have considered yourself finished too. So I am leaving you the 18 feet, because I know you will not be able to look at it and walk away. I know you will tie a rope around your waist and climb down into the dark, because that is who you have always been. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Ruth Avery. You just don't believe it yet. She had been called many things in 68 years. Patient, kind, a good teacher, a good wife, reliable. But she had never been called strong, not by her parents, not by her children, not in 43 years by Harold himself. She had not known he thought it. The last visible line was unfinished. The sentence stopped mid-thought, no closing, no signature. He had been writing this in the last weeks of his life and had not been able to finish it. He had run out of time. Ruth held the letter against her chest and let the tears come without trying to wipe them away. Quiet tears. The kind that come at the end of a long day of a long year. After a long while, she folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope. She sat on the porch until the stars came all the way out. Then she sat a little longer. She went inside around 11. For the first time in 75 nights, She slept all the way through until morning. She woke at 6:15 to the sound of birds in the pecan saplings, and she understood fully for the first time what Harold had done. He had not just left her a well. He had left her a life. He had known that grief, the kind that comes at the end of 43 years of being married to the same person, was not something a person survived by talking about. It was something a person survived by doing. So he had left her something to do. Something so big and so impossible and so clearly hers that she could not refuse it. He had bet his last 20 years on her, on the woman he believed she had always been, and he had carved that bet into 18 feet of rock and clay. She got up. She made coffee. She set out 2 mugs. She drank one. She picked up Harold's mug. She did not put it back on the shelf this morning. She carried it outside to the porch and set it on the railing beside her own. "Good morning, Harold," she said. She had not said it out loud before. She said it every morning after that for the rest of her life. The garden grew through the fall and into the next spring. Jesse completed an agricultural extension program and started a small landscaping business from a shed Ruth let him build on the property. Margaret still came for coffee on Tuesdays every Tuesday for the rest of her life. Claire brought her children every other weekend, and the kids started calling the place Grandpa's land. Ben came home for Thanksgiving. The following spring, he was married in the garden under an arch of pecan branches. Dale Gentry's development went up on the parcel east of Ruth's property 6 months later. A strip mall, concrete and fluorescent lights. It failed within 2 years. The building sat empty after that, cracking slowly in the sun, while Ruth's garden grew taller on the other side of the fence. The well still drew water. The land still grew. The pecan saplings rose year by year toward the sky Harold had drawn on his survey map in 1978. And Ruth, who had climbed down into the dark at 68 years old and found at the bottom every single thing her husband could not say out loud, woke up every morning with dirt under her nails and somewhere to be. She set out 2 coffee cups every morning all the way to the end of her life. She poured one. She put the other back. And every morning at the kitchen window in the gray dawn light, looking out at red earth that had finally become what her husband always knew it would be, Ruth Avery said the same 3 words to the empty room behind her. "Good morning, Harold." And then she went back to work. Some men leave their wives a finished story. Harold left Ruth the last page and the pen and the quiet, stubborn faith that she would write it herself. She wrote it. A dry well isn't empty. It's just not finished yet. Thank you for listening. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. All names and events are imaginary. We hope it reminds you that the people who love us don't always say it in words. Sometimes they say it in work, in patience, in things they build that they never get to see completed. And sometimes the greatest gift a person can leave behind is not the answer, but the reason to keep going.